Hi, everyone. This is Chris Horton, and we're doing a podcast discussion on media literacies. I'm here with Mike.
Hi, everybody. This is Michael Califano.
And like I said, we're going to be doing that discussion on the media literacies readings for this week. So, Michael, do you want to get started and get us started with the discussion?
Yeah, the first one I wanted to talk about first was something that I highlighted in the first article, the Digital Media and Learning as an Emerging Field, Part 1. There was a question that I really liked in it, and it was how can we, coming from different disciplines and having taken different routes here, collaborate to define and develop this new place, our shared interest in digital media and learning? So this kind of, I felt, connected with the other readings as well, because the other readings bring up how we can all see the same things happening, but we still all come to our different conclusions. And I think that the first article is more technical with the different types of literacies and fields of study in which you can go about it. But the other ones are not really about studies, but rather about the human brain. So I just found that interesting how that question could connect to all of the readings we did for today.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and also kind of similar to that, the idea of cross-discipline collaboration and how it's difficult, but at the same time, it's very important, especially in the modern uh, digitally connected world where everything isn't broken up as easily into history and English and math and science. So
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a
Definitely.
good kind of thing.
Yeah. And it also points out how we all have different ways in which we come to the same, all readings really, how we all come to the same conclusions, but we have different processes of coming to those conclusions. So 2 + 2 = 4, but you can think of it as a different way where you can add up, like I'll just add 2 + 2, but another person will add 1 + 1 + 1. Like, I don't know if that explains it well,
No,
but it's,
exactly right.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
there's
different
different ways to
process.
get to the same answer,
Exactly. And
kind
I
of
think
thing.
that that was the kind of thing that the first reading was extensive in the different processes that may come about. And I think that even then, they didn't really, I think they could have gone even further if they wanted to. I mean, the reading was pretty lengthy as it was with some of the
Right.
studies, but I think if somebody was really interested in it, they can find more ways in which that another process that they can come to the same conclusion with somebody else.
Right. Well, I think that's an interesting thing to bring up because the Manjoo articles I think almost took the opposite take, where we all might have the same sources or the same information, but we get to different answers based on some of our biases and things like that. And I think that was sort of a big point coming out of the other two readings.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote down. Actually, I wrote down that it was that it's the that the those readings were opposed to the first reading we did, the exact opposite, in which we all
Right.
see the same thing, but we're not coming to the same conclusions.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think the second chapter of his, or chapter 3 that we had to read from Manju, was
Mm-hmm.
sort of the big kind of dive into that, where he's talking about the same sort of information, which is video or sort of photographic evidence, but some people will see something that pretty much no one else does, and there's this sort of small group that will see kind of almost their own bias reflected in a single piece of information that everyone is interpreting.
Yeah. Well, I even saw, like, reading these two articles, especially the introduction, it made me think of how like, just in today's society, especially with politics today, how some people can look at one person and be like, I don't understand how people can like that person, but it's the same on the other side. And I found it interesting once I really started reading into it, because I'm one of those people where I say, not that I'm judging, but I really like sit down and think, okay, how can what's the rationale behind this person liking this candidate, and
Right,
why don't
yeah.
they like that candidate? Like, I just found it
Right,
really
it's trying to
interesting.
understand kind of.
Hmm. So I just both the Manchu articles were really interesting in the sense that they talks about more so the 9/11 piece, but how the eyes and ears are seeing one thing, and they're seeing the same thing as the person next to you, but the way you think is like a different kind of literary study, in
Right,
which
yeah.
from somebody else, there's not really every few people are going to have a different way in which they um, study like digital media, and every every person's going to have a different way in which the process in which they think about certain things like politics or 9/11 or things like that.
Right. I thought that was some of the best parts of the Manjoo article is him kind of describing some of the more psychological parts of what
Yeah,
that might mean. And I think it's just sort of a consequence of living in the modern world when everybody has a cell phone. So pretty much any incident, there's at least a couple cameras covering it, probably more
yeah,
so. So there's so much information that it's difficult for people to sort through.
yeah.
And our psychology just isn't really built for that sort of thing.
hmm Especially with something like 9/11, I think that reading it, just like not to be get like a therapist or something, but I think that
Right.
it was so traumatic that people are thinking, okay, it can't just be this random act of
Right. It can't be that simple
violence.
kind of
It has
thing.
to be
Right.
something else.
Exactly.
And I think that may be some way of people's way to deal with it and grieve. Yet, and at the same time, it's other people's. It's maybe just the same thing that I was saying before, in which they truly believe it and they have a different and they have their reasoning.
Right. Exactly. And I think it's again one of those things of when all the eyes are kind of on something, it's easier, I think, or more common, I guess, to sort of question it because everybody is looking at this one piece of information. Like it's kind of similar with the Kennedy assassination that he talks about later on, where
Yeah.
all the eyes are looking at just this one image or just this one video,
Mm-hmm.
and it sort of gets the mind going. And again, yeah, it might be sort of a kind of a coping mechanism almost.
Yeah. Because I mean, reading the articles, my own personal view didn't align with them, but it was interesting to see um, how people thought of it from that perspective. Because I mean, 9/11, that I've heard this theory before, and it's one of the theories that kind of like, not that I get angry, but I get irritated sometimes. I'm like, okay, well,
Yeah.
as somebody who's known people who were killed in 9/11, I just don't see it from the theory that they're
Right. See it
saying.
bearing
I
out.
don't see
Right.
how, yeah. But I mean, after reading it, I can understand how they think that way. Do I agree with them? No, it didn't really change my perspective, but I can see why they would think in a certain way. And I think that's the same even today with people with different political views. I
Hmm.
think that I'm one of the people that I'm able to listen to you.
Hmm.
And if you disagree with me, I'm like, okay, that's your opinion. But there are some that are like, no, you can't. You have to agree, and this is why you have to agree. And there's
Right.
people that you can agree, and if you don't agree with how they got there, they get angry too. So it's ridiculous to think that everybody comes to the same conclusion the same way. It's
Right.
either they come to
Exactly.
the same conclusion in their own way or a different conclusion, but using the same kind of thought process sees that go with getting to the opposing conclusion.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of a good point, maybe a good segue into the other Manju article, the Why Facts No Longer Matter,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I thought was really interesting, especially as a history person, because one of the big problems in history is that you never have enough information. So you never know. A couple thousand years ago, there's a few sources that you might get, and you really have to weigh those sources to see what you're actually finding. But I think the problem now is there's too much information. We have too much to sort through, and we don't know the difference between a good source and a bad source, and even a good fact and a bad fact. Like,
Yeah,
what does that mean? And I think it's an interesting kind of thing to deal with.
yeah. I think that also we in our day and age we are used to so much being available so quickly to us
Hmm.
that we don't stop and think of what's good and not good sources.
Right.
And I think that that's part of the times we live in. You're just a victim to the times you live in,
Yeah, of
and
course.
it's you are used to everything coming up right away. You're never really told to look into it until like college, high school or college. But
Hmm.
if you see something that's come up and you think and it's on the internet, you would think to a certain age, oh, this is on the internet, so it has to be true. And now people
Right.
laugh at it and say because clearly it's not. And I think hopefully people are starting to get that idea that you have to look into it and look into different sources and reputable sources, not just like Wikipedia.
Right, yeah. One of my favorite jokes is the picture of Abraham Lincoln where it says, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet," and it's a quote that apparently that's like attributed to him.
Yeah,
But it's just kind of one of those things where, yeah, it's that kind of world we live in, and it's that kind of idea of um, everything is kind of at your fingertips, but it's almost too much, and it's kind of overwhelming, and it is difficult to analyze all of those different sources.
yeah. For the last part of that introduction, actually, when I just highlighted basically the last paragraph,
Hmm.
and because I thought it was going to be more about what people thought and their conclusions.
Hmm.
So I actually wrote a note. I said he's not looking at what people believe, rather how they come to believe it and how they convince themselves to believe one thing over another. Because I think that certain people hear certain things and it just kind of sticks. And even if that statement is proven to be false, they can come up with a way to either rationalize why they thought that way or continue thinking that way.
Right, exactly. Well, it's the idea of I already went through the effort of having this opinion, so now I have
Yeah.
to justify it.
Yeah. And there are certain people that are just stubborn and just won't
Right,
admit they're wrong
exactly.
and think,
Yeah.
okay, well, how am I going to spin this?
Right.
So,
Yeah, well that the last sentence of that chapter is how can so many people who live in the same place see the world so differently?
yeah.
And I think that's kind of a really good sort of lead in to the rest of his
Yeah.
book, it seems, which he's not concerned about what you believe necessarily, but kind of how you come to that conclusion.
Yeah. Because I don't think he ever really states where he stands in these
Right.
arguments, but he's laying out the facts. He's not bringing
Hmm.
himself into it. And he's leaving it up to the reader to make their own decisions and
Right.
also think about how they come to those decisions, the process in which they do it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's more about the process of coming to conclusions and kind of gathering that information. Because again, I think it's one of those things of there is so much information out there that it's almost the opposite problem that we've had for centuries.
Yeah. So, but no, I found the readings overall really interesting in that sense. Connecting it to the actual like digital literacies, at certain times I was kind of lost in how they connected, but I think I have an idea of how they're connected now in the sense
Hmm.
that, like I said earlier in the podcast, that they each he kind of breaks down each section as a way in which people can study digital literacy. So I think that that's kind of like a guide, I guess you can say, for different ways, just a few examples of how people come to those conclusions. And I think that's what I think the Manjoo articles really reinforce that kind of thinking.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think even just going to the literal definition of literacy, it's being able to read,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that in this sort of instance, it goes beyond the literal being able to read the words, but being able to kind of interpret something.
Yeah,
So what is the difference between two sources that say completely different things, but maybe talking about the same event? What
yeah,
is the difference between those two? Which one is maybe more valid or less valid or something like
mm-hmm.
that? So I think that's sort of one of the main tie-ins to digital literacies is how can we be um, able to read this stuff and able to interpret it in the
Yeah.
21st century.
I think that would be a good idea too, like in the classroom,
Hmm.
having students read different articles and come up with different readings and come up with different um, what's it called, different opinions
Right.
and results, and then telling students, okay, now find what you did with now partner up with another student and find what you did and see what's similar and what's different, and if you were able, if it was the same process but just a different outcome, or the same outcome but different process, and that kind of thing.
Hmm. Right. Or even something like something just as simple as find the same event reported in two different papers or
Mm-hmm.
two different outlets. How is it reported differently?
Yeah,
Even just something that simple, just the first two results you see on Google or something. How
yeah,
are those two different?
yeah. I just like, especially with this class, I feel that it's very up to date, And
Hmm.
after reading or doing something, I like see it everywhere. Like last week was the universal S, and like
Right.
for 3 days after reading that and doing that assignment, I saw that S everywhere,
I know.
and different phrases that are used in some of our readings. I see or I hear more recently after. I'm like, is it just because I did the reading and I'm hearing it now, or has
Right.
this
That
always
you're
been?
right. Well, that's something I noticed is I'm kind of confused about what I read in this class and what I read for other classes because it
Yeah,
is very similar and it is something that's sort of being pushed is this idea of, how do we train students to live in the world that they're going to be living in the
yeah.
21st century in
But
this
this
world of
one, yeah,
connected and whatever.
yeah. But this one I think was very relevant to today because I
Hmm.
mean I don't want to make it political, but that's where I went to only
No,
because
right,
I'm into politics and things like that. So I saw
right.
that in the sense that it was very similar in how I think of certain people or how people think of how I come to my views and
No,
things like
exactly.
that.
And it's a fair kind of point to jump to because that is one of the areas that it's probably the easiest to find no matter what, whether you're mainstream or completely out to the fringes, you can still find something to justify what you're saying and your beliefs.
Yeah,
And I think that's one of kind of the easiest locations to draw that idea
yeah,
into.
yeah. I agree.
So yeah, I thought it was a very good set of readings for this week. Very, very interesting set of readings. They definitely kind of kept me engaged.
Yeah,
Um, and I think they're very, very important for teaching and just even for living and being a citizen of the modern world.
yeah. I think that it was I agree with you. I enjoyed the readings this week, and I think that it was more so because you got one article that was about the logistics and about the class, and then you got two articles that were not necessarily about what we're learning in class, but it still reinforced what we were reading. And I think that it was more close to home in
Right.
terms and things and readings that we can understand and we can connect to. And I forgot where it was, but that was also something that I think in the first article about the digital literacies had mentioned that
Hmm.
connecting it to studies show how connecting it to students' real lives make them more active and more understanding and with the learning. And I feel that also that's why we're constantly told as teachers always connect it to a student's life, find a way to connect it to a student's personal life.
Right.
And I think
Exactly.
that that's what these articles did.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it was a good split of sort of more technical stuff and more kind of not more casual reading, I
Yeah,
guess you could say. So yeah, I thought it was a good kind of split this week and a good example of uh, why some of these things that we're talking about how they apply to sort of the real world, even outside of the classroom, but I think especially in the classroom.
yeah, I agree.
All right, so I think that's a good place to wrap up for the day. So thank you, Michael, for having this discussion.
Thank you, Chris.
And thanks to everyone for listening to our discussion this week.